Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Way We Grow podcast, a production of the Craft Growers Network. I'm your host, Nick Wolfe. Today, we actually have two guests on. They are Sharkmouse and Flow3rfox. Welcome to the show, guys. How are you doing today?
Wonderful. Thank you for having us on. We appreciate it.
Awesome.
Great.
Good
How are
to
you doing?
hear. I'm doing well myself. Just, it's been pretty busy at the cultivation facility that I work at, and we've just been trying to perfect every little thing. So it's great to have some like-minded perfectionists in the building talking about some grow stuff today.
Well, I'll be completely honest. Not having had plants in the ground for a couple of months now, I've started to get the itch. So I'm looking forward to talking shop for sure.
For sure. Well, like right off the bat then, because it feels as though there's been some new stuff in your grow world lately, why don't you both talk about a little bit of what you've been doing over the past few months and how you've slowly taken down the one big old flowering room and done something else with it.
So I don't know how many of your viewers are gonna recognize me from a previous iteration of what I did. I'm SharkmouseFarms, previously on Instagram, and obviously my whole thing was cultivation education made accessible to the average home grower. I like to take complex subjects and break them down and distill them into actionable, executable topics that we were all capable of going right now down into our tent or our grow room and implementing and seeing some progress and improvement in our SOPs over what we had been doing previously. Unfortunately, as I'm sure all of us are quite familiar with Instagram's random decision-making processes when it comes to what is and what isn't allowed as far as content. My page went down without any warning whatsoever back in November with 92,000 followers. And I had made the decision after that had happened that, it was unlikely that I'd be able to regain the same kind of momentum that I had hit a few years previously that allowed me to grow to that stage. And as unfortunate as it felt like an opportunity to push myself a little further into something new, into something more sustainable from, a social aspect and an educational aspect, pardon me, but also feels like that's where the industry is heading. And I've always prided myself on trying to be on the cutting edge of where we were going and where we were trying to be as an industry, as a niche, as a market. So tissue culture felt like the next logical step. And from a functional perspective, it just felt like the right move to transition that one big flower room, that when it came down to it, just ended up producing flower for myself and Follow3rfox, on a personal level, transitioning that room into a micropropagation and tissue culture and mycelium lab where Follow3rfox can continue to cultivate not only new phenotypes that we're getting from various breeders that we like to work with, but also some of the tissue culture samples that I'll be pulling out of my lab. And it seems like a pretty seamless transition to go from educating, like you had alluded to earlier, the level of perfectionism that I like to bring to the table, going from cultivation to where I believe the market will end up being based on what we're seeing today in the industry, into tissue culture and try and bring some of you over with me earlier on in the game.
Right on. And what about on the mycelium side of things?
So that's been something I've wanted to do for quite some time. I'm very excited that he's turned it into a tissue culture lab, and I love watching and learning. And I think it's a great step forward. And it was absolutely unfortunate what Instagram did, but I think it was the perfect time to pivot. And I'm super excited for what's next. I'm also very happy that I get to use that space for mycelium. This is something so new to me, but it's something that I've wanted to do for a long time now. I just didn't have the proper space or environment to do it.
You also have previous experience with mushrooms, just not in a lab setting.
Not in a lab setting. I just tried to grow them in a tent downstairs. And I didn't have
Sure.
my temperatures right, but I did enjoy it, and I got some gorgeous, like huge, great oyster mushrooms. I did lion's mane, I did turkey tail before, so I did spend a little bit of time last year doing that. So I'm
Nice.
excited to continue on.
Yeah, I love that it's kind of this dual functionality where anything that you need to just use like aseptic technique, you can kind of just bust out the flow hood, get right to it. You already have your procedures in place, so it's just a nice
Yeah, no,
transition
it's
either.
absolutely great that we can both use this space, which is really exciting as well.
Yeah,
Well,
that's really awesome.
as you just mentioned, a lot of the SOPs are directly transitionable to both functions, which is nice to be able to, if I'm implementing a specific descrub technique, for example, that I'll be utilizing for my tissue culture, the same thing will apply to what she's doing when entering the room as well. So there's a lot of direct crossover. There's a lot of learning opportunity on both sides to sort of um, cross paths and pick up a new sort of area of expertise, if you will, for both of us, which is always nice to add tools to the toolbox.
For sure. Well, I mean, let's start at where the toolbox started then, and let's go back to what were some of your first experiences with plants in general. Um, I like to, say sometimes cannabis starts the journey into vegetables, and sometimes it's vegetables that you have your first experience with grandma or mom or dad or some relative or some friend. So where did cultivation start for both of you?
Well, quite honestly, Nicole's Follow3rfox has been the expert when it came to plants long before I ever even showed any specific aptitude for it. When we were young kids, she was doing her thing at a nursery, teaching me about house plants and how to work in the garden, and she's got family lineage who work in horticulture, so I'll let her take that one and go with it, and then we can get to me after for sure.
Yeah,
Sounds good.
so gardening is definitely in my blood. My first job was at a nursery, and I spent many years there, and I learned a lot about tropical plants and perennials and annuals. Um, Now he took the leap first into the cannabis journey, and I kind of stood back for quite some time and just observed and watched what he was doing. And then I started mixing nutrients, and then I guess I got more and more involved, and then I wanted to take off and grow my own plants, and it's been quite the journey. But I'm so glad that he started first and convinced me to start growing as well. He's been a huge motivation and teacher through all of this with my
For sure.
endless
So
questions and so on and so forth.
So
I've
about how
I've
long do
been
you think you guys have been growing then?
I've been throwing bag seed into the ground since I was a teenager. When my stepdad would, we'd go gorilla seed the forest in our backyard or whatever, and it was, it's always fun to come back in August and see, like, this 6 foot tall plant that obviously I wasn't paying very much attention to, but it sets that sort of internal seed for you of, like, falling in love with the process, right? Understanding the timelines and all that. But about 8 years ago, we had, just like everybody else, had gotten sick and tired of running back and forth to the plug, to the dispensary. Hey, sure, we'll give it a shot to try our hand at growing. How hard could it be, right? We'll put 2 plants in the ground, and the the immediacy with which I was humbled from my original idea with what it was going to be to how it turned out was more of a driver than anything else for me, right? And as you could probably tell, I'm a little bit obsessive when I latch onto something, and trying to understand why it wasn't exactly what I thought it was going to be became the inherent driver for me. And from that moment on, it's never really been about the plants for me, I guess. It's always been about the process getting to the plants. And I love cannabis, I love flower, but more than that, I love the intricacies of the process, the biology, the physiology, the physics involved, the chemistry involved. It's all so fractal, and you can keep going further and further and further. And there's always a new thing to, aha, that's why. So I guess where this all started was the inability to access any of that information, right? You'd go on 7 or 8 years ago to Reddit or Roll It Up 420, and you ask any question you put up, you'd get 35 different answers, none of which were based in any sort of empirical evidence, all of which were just anecdotal opinions from people who had experienced something that looked potentially similar, right? And that for me was an immediate red flag. Like, okay, well, like you can go anywhere in agriculture and find very specifically what any of the functionalities of the plant are from a a microscopic level, and we can't do that here. And I know that in Canada specifically, especially during the early 2000s, there was tons of research. It just wasn't available. We couldn't get it. We didn't know where to find it.
Right.
So I started chasing it and basically found the need to reverse engineer a botany degree from the topics. I'd started a very high level topic, and I'd read through a peer reviewed paper, and I'd come up to a segment of that paper that I didn't understand what I was reading. So I'd have to go back, and now I'm reading a peer reviewed paper on what this subject is, and I don't understand something here. And we just kept going back and back and back till, I found myself back in grade 11 chemistry again, understanding what photosynthesis actually was and how it drove various systems within the plant. And that for me is just what I find most enthralling about growing in general.
For sure. I can agree with that wholeheartedly. It seems like there was not a lot of accessible information early on. And because there was information out there, but the application to cannabis seemed so esoteric, it was made to almost seem like there was this magic happening when it's just another plant and it just does the same things other plants do, but it assimilates nutrients in its own way. And so one of the books that was available earlier was something like Plant Empowerment, right, but no one told you to go and look at plant empowerment and then start applying that to your cannabis, and boom, all your greenhouse yields start skyrocketing and all your indoor environmental parameters are that much tighter. And it didn't seem like it was hard.
Quite honestly,
I also found asking the question, asking anyone back then, nobody wanted to help, nobody wanted to tell you anything, and everyone's so set in their ways too. So
even now, that's such a great point. Is that even now it's such an ego-driven industry that it's almost like taboo to admit that you don't understand a specific aspect of what you're doing, and to just sort of power through it so that nobody else knows that you don't know what you're doing, and that it builds this entire generational sort of foundation of anecdotal experience based on nothing but guesswork because everybody's too afraid to sort of ask the question. And it's such a great point. Sure. Is not only even back then, but even now, a lot of people are oh yeah, I knew that, and just sort of brush past it without ever trying to actually understand it. Whereas, for us, we find that being wrong is not a knock on your skill set. It's not a weakness towards your personality. It's what science is, right? Being wrong means we now get to find the right answer. So, whatever that answer is, we'll just chase the data down, and it doesn't impact me personally. I'll just adjust
keep trying and
we'll
figure it out
based on what the data tells us.
Yeah, absolutely. It's unfortunate how much of it is like a fake it till you make it mentality, and too many people are ego driven in this industry because I feel like there's this thing with branding where you have to have this personality, and because so much of what's going on right now in the industry is you have to have branding to make sure that people remember your face when Instagram takes you down one day, and you have to pop up with a new account the next day and have the same people be able to come and find you. It's things like that limit our ability to just maintain some sort of honest reputation in certain aspects. And that's really frustrating. And it is hard then to even continue to try to share like applicable knowledge when people have encampments that they're sitting in saying, oh, well,
Well,
this is better than that, or
Yeah.
how do you know what you're talking about? You know, I grow organic. You don't know what you're talking about. You grow in with salts. And I'm like, sure, I have no idea what I'm talking about. That's
and
fine.
then then
I can't
try
argue with that.
try and come at that. Try and come at that perspective as a woman, as I imagine Flower Fox has to deal with, trying to have to validate yourself simply because we're in such a male dominated industry where ego is such a big driver of the fact. And oh, here comes this little girl, what could she possibly know about, when in fact she's a phenomenal cultivator who knows more about the intrinsics about every facet of the plant than a lot of the people I've had the pleasure of encountering. So there's such weird unnecessary entries to barrier for so many different groups of people in this industry that I think are so easily knocked down when we eliminate the veils of the aesthetic we all try to hold up here.
For sure. Well, let's take it back a little bit then to when you both started cultivating cannabis. It sounds like Shark, you were kind of taking that dive first, but what were some of those first harvests like, and when did you guys find some really good success with what you were experimenting with?
Nicole, what was your first
Um,
harvest like?
well, my first harvest, I tried to like fully let me take the lead, and I was a little stubborn, and I guess I should have listened more. And I was hanging my plants off the rafters of the, the thing as I let everything stretch, and I didn't listen. But I must say that like with every grow, I learned so much. I made a lot of mistakes, and each grow was unbelievably better than the last, and it's only gone up since then.
So
And I'm all about the constructive criticism now.
from the very beginning, when I started, making an attempt at doing this seriously, and deciding that this is what I was going to be, that I wanted to do, I had it in my head that this was going to be data driven one way or another, no matter how rudimentary that data started out being, was that I was going to be able to implement some form of repeatability here. And I wanted predictability in my SOP, so that I knew no matter how bad this first one ended up being, right? No matter how grandiose my idea was that it was going to turn out to be, that at the end I'd be able to look back and say, well, this is exactly what I did to get here, um, and this is what I feel worked versus this is what I feel didn't work. Now, obviously, without a vast pool of experience, and especially practical experience, it's hard to sit there after your first grow and say, okay, this is what I did and this is what worked. But at least, when you go back and you're now still reading things on Reddit, and you're asking your questions on Roll It Up 420, and now we're trying different things because, people are telling you, no, this is the way you should do it. And now we go back and we cross-reference. Okay, well, I didn't do that the first time, and I saw an improvement here, and we start to mitigate the things we're finding aren't working for us. And the more I chased that repeatability, the more success I started to find. Obviously, once I started to understand how powerful a tool automation could be towards achieving that repeatability, that's when I started seeing actual success, right? And I know I catch a lot of flack for it all the time, is that not everyone can automate, and some people like to just connect with their plants. And I will never take that away from anybody. I'll never insist that somebody spends without outside of their means in order to achieve this 100% dialed in environment, especially if it's just you love to go down and water your plants. But what I will give you is what the data tells me about automating a space 24 hours a day on 100 different metrics versus a human being who can't possibly manage that many metrics that minutely, that often. There is a vast difference in the performance of the plant, simply based on kinesiology and physiology. And
I
and
can I can fully agree to that. Like, I was pretty stubborn. I loved hand watering. I felt that if I gave up hand watering, I was not going to be able to connect and be in that space. But like, honestly, I'm in my space a million times more, and the difference is night and day. Like,
Yep.
I tried to keep up even with his SOPs. Like, I followed it to a T, hand watering. I was hand watering 7 to 8 times a day in flower. Like, I wanted to keep up to that, but it's night and day. It makes such a difference, and you get to actually spend time being there, keeping your space clean, making sure everything's
And the fact of the
running
matter
properly.
is you hear a lot of, one of the bigger arguments against automating a space from a home grower perspective is that they have this romanticized view of their part in the gardening process, and it's spiritual, and I don't want to take away from that, but at the same time, what I can say is that, automating your space doesn't negate you being a part of the process. You're still a driver of that process. You still have to obviously understand the nuances of the systems that are occurring within that plant, and curate your program in order to satiate and make those plants happy. Like, this is to use their terms, connecting with your plants on a level that's even more, I want to say, in sync with what your plants are feeling, and in tune with their energy, or whatever it is we're trying to achieve. Because now we're looking at every minuscule aspect, and every tiny function that's happening within that plant on such a scaled down perspective, that I've got such a better picture of what my plant is doing versus going in and hand watering and seeing if the leaves are droopy, and just sort of feeling the plant, which again I
Taking
don't
away
want
that guesswork. Like,
Yeah.
I think it's right, like Nicole, you can attest to the fact that it felt like you were more in tune with your plants when you were hand watering, until you started automating that process and realizing that, like, now I can read better.
I know what's going on. Like, I can catch myself much quicker. Like, I just feel they're much happier. My yield is much incredible night and day difference. Like,
and we have more data on how the plant is feeling at any given moment,
and
which
I
is,
still spend just as much time down there. Like, I don't
Yep.
really see a difference.
unless you want
I,
to, right? And the
Yeah.
other aspect is, if she needed to go away for a day and a
Well,
half,
see,
and
that's another thing. Like, we've got 5 kids. Like, some days are crazy. Like, at least I know my plants are being taken care of. At never at any point am I neglecting them, and like, I can go about what needs to be done. And when chaos happens, I'm not worried, which is huge. Like, people are busy. Life is busy. You still deserve to have a
absolutely.
garden. Like, at the same time, I still want my garden, but some days are just
Yeah, I feel like automation doesn't necessarily remove your attention to details. It removes your distraction from the details,
yes,
because you
exactly
have
that.
the
It lets you
ability.
focus more on like what needs to be done.
Absolutely. I feel like a lot of people, they look at automation as this thing where they have to automate everything. And in some cases, you can just automate certain aspects of your grow. Like, let's say you still need to hand water. You can maybe automate your, if you're using an intake and exhaust system, you can
manage
automate
your
it to a
VPD.
point where it has some parameters for VPD, or you can maybe automate your air conditioning or heat or humidity, or
Yeah,
Just
just
to
different things
eliminate,
like
just to
that.
simply
just certain
eliminate
parts of it.
fluctuations of you having to come in and check and see that, oh, it's dipped a little bit, I'll better turn it up, which, over the course of an hour and a half, it's gone down 3 degrees, and, it doesn't seem like a big deal. But those fluctuations, and we'll get into this in more detail if you'd like in a bit, those fluctuations over the course of 24 hours are limiting the amount of time your plants have in a 12-hour light cycle to utilize everything we're trying to provide it in that time, if it's falling outside of those optimal parameters for an hour here, an hour there, in and out, right? So the the
Right.
the more we can mitigate those fluctuations in any capacity, if it's whatever our limiting factor is, the higher we can push that ceiling. and the more of those ceilings we can move up, the higher we're going to see an exponential progress happening in our performance in the garden.
Absolutely. It feels like Liebig's law keeps coming up in my conversations lately, where you have like the different staves, and if one of them is too low, then that's as far as you can fill that barrel. And even if you have other parameters that are set ideally at other set points and conditions, there's something else holding you back. And so finding those little things.
If we're pushing in 1500 ppfd of light because we're pushing 3.0 EC and we're scaling it up to, you know, a 10 PWEC by our peak dryback, but our VPD isn't on point, right? So that one little uptick in our SOP is now causing that VPD to be our limiting factor, and we're going to see exponential problems start working their way outwards because of that one little ripple in the system that's causing these cataclysmic outward waves, almost like a ripple in a pond, right?
Absolutely. And you know, sometimes I feel like people try to perfect the little minutia within all of these different settings within a grow, and sometimes you have to allow for a little bit of wiggle room on either end if your control parameters can't be as tight as you would want them.
Well, and that begs the question: would you rather have all of your parameters 100% dialed into spec with one of them uncontrollable and falling completely out of spec, or would you rather have all of your parameters within an acceptable range and none of them falling completely out of spec, right? Like there's a dichotomy there where you have to decide and sort of formulate what you're capable of of controlling in your space, and where you want to sort of give back, if that makes sense, right? Like, so at some point, none of us can have it 100% perfect at all times. So, for example, right, if I can't get my humidity on point, do I scale back the lighting a little bit, or do I just keep everything as it is and just try and push through that one humidity issue, right? Or do I bring the room back to where that humidity is no longer an issue? And I'll be giving up. I'll be leaving something on the table somewhere in order to achieve that. It's just a matter of what's going to be the bigger risk, the least impact.
Well, it feels like sometimes those different aspects of, like, let's say you do have something where you can't control humidity, but you can push everything else, you know, at 100%, let's say, then I feel like the thing that it affects in the end is the quality, because we have this, you know, it is a special plant in a certain way, because it does have all these different needs that can be met that then produce this really exceptional end product that can be so unique and different based on the different environmental parameters. And so, like, let's say you are in a situation where you're running really high VPD throughout the grow just because you have low humidity, you're north in the latitudes, and you just get really cold and dry in winter. Yep. So yeah, if you can't really get that part up, then maybe you bring everything else down, because that might be your best option for quality. But if you need quantity, then maybe you're okay with a little bit lower quality.
Right. So the analogy I guess would be is, you know, you've got a race car on the racetrack in the middle of a race, right? And when you floor that gas pedal, you've blown one valve. Do you keep pushing as hard as you can to try and get it across the finish line, or do you ease off the gas pedal and try and preserve the engine so there's a chance you at least cross in third? Do you know what I mean? Or do you go for first and chance you blow the motor and don't even cross the line at all, right?
That's it. Yeah, exactly. Because sometimes you see those parts where one aspect of the grow kind of crashes out and the entire grow just does not make it to the finish line, or what does make it to the finish line is pretty much like,
but it's suffered.
This is edibles at best.
All right. Get the washers. We're washing it up.
Yeah. Right. Well, so when do you feel like you other than automation, where do you feel like you found early success with your growing style, and what kind of led you or like pushed you towards the different aspects of what you kind of explored to try and either increase quality or increase some sort of helpful parameter of what the end product was? Because I feel like you have a few of those tricks that commercial cultivators will keep really close to the chest, but that you seem to talk about openly in
So
terms of helping people.
one of the easiest ones. I mean, it's obviously not an easy topic. It's relatively complex, but one of the first most immediate ones that comes to mind is high frequency fertigation and understanding how PWEC, VWC, and water
I'm
potential.
sorry, I've got to sneak out. I've got to go catch.
No worries. Thank you so much for joining us. If you want to hop
It's a
back in later,
pleasure.
feel free.
Yeah, I'll try to hop back in later. Thanks so much.
For sure.
I think one of the ways I like to educate is a little different than I tend to see a lot of the other cultivation educators doing. It is that everybody likes to say, here's step A, B, C, D, E, F, G, all the way through Z. Follow these, and this is how it'll do it. But that leads us as consumers of that education to just try to hit numbers that we don't necessarily understand, right? As long as they hit those numbers, it'll be fine. But as soon as something goes a little off track, we don't have the comprehension to understand how to A, bring it back, or B, why it's continuing to slide left or right. And I think not focusing on here's how you germinate a seed, 80-80, whatever, right? Let it germinate in the dark, put it out, put it in your solo cup, and not giving you the linear steps of how to grow a plant, but focusing on the systems that are occurring within the plant itself. It's a living being, and understanding how all of those functions are operating in unison to create this symbiotic process that's machine-like, right? And if we understand osmotic pressure, and we understand water potential, and we understand vapor pressure, we understand transpiration. If we understand transpiration, we understand how water movement occurs within the plant. And if we understand that, along with understanding osmotic potential, we know how we can drive that up in order to force a higher uptake of ions, and all of these fancy sounding technical terms that we're trying to get to, stacking high PWEC in during bulk. These are all just buzzwords unless we understand what the plant itself is doing on an ionic level, on a microscopic level, on a cellular level, that's allowing these things to happen. And as soon as I started focusing on that, I understood how high frequency fertigation could be much more beneficial than what I was trying to accomplish, just throwing water in the pot and hoping that it takes it up. And as soon as we start doing that, we can start tightening in our irrigation SOPs. And the tighter that irrigation SOP becomes, through experience and through understanding the system itself, water adhesion, water potential, matric potential, osmotic balance and gradient, understanding those. And it sounds like a lot when I just said it to you right now in an unbroken sentence. But the fact of the matter is, each of those concepts are something that we've all basically already understand, just not in this context. So understanding that water likes to stick to itself, right? That means that the drier the cocoa gets, the harder it's going to be for the plant to pull up water away from the fibers of the soil that it's sticking to. You know this already, but having me explain it to you in the context of what's happening when you water your plant, now you have this, that makes sense to me. So you're no longer looking at your drying out pot as, is it too dry? Is it not too dry? Now you're looking at it in the context of matric potential, and how far can I dry back while the roots build up osmotic gradient in order to pull those increased salts. And it makes sense to you now as somebody who doesn't have a degree in biochemistry. I don't. But when I was able to put watering into that context, it all made sense. And from there, I was able to improve my process simply because I understood what was happening from a thermodynamics perspective or a fluid mechanics perspective, right? No longer a whatever the nutrient manual is telling me perspective. It's two different ways of looking at of what you're trying to accomplish. One just allows you to understand the complexities of what it is you're doing.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, I've heard it described as simply as plants just being water pumps, and they're just taking water from the ground and pushing it out into the air. And then, yeah, by applying the different ideas of, there's that old chemistry experiment for like first, there's like really young kids, and you take salty water and you pour it into a beaker, and then you pour fresh water on top of it, and you can color one of them, and you can see how they sit in the difference, and then you can go, oh, so why do they do that?
So that's
Right.
exactly what I was alluding to, is that we know all of these concepts. We're taught them in a very functional way at a very early age, how all of these things work. It's just a matter of applying those concepts of physics to what it is we're doing. And one of the first tips I give anybody is, if you've got access to a grade 11 biology book, go crack that son of a bitch open, because it'll tell you a lot about it'll tell you about a lot about cellular mitosis and how osmosis works, and almost 3/4 of what you're going to open in those pages, you can then turn around and go back and say, oh, that's actually happening right here in my garden when I see I'm adding too much calcium. Or you read, for example, in those books how chemical bonds happen, and understand that with an increased amount of calcium ions in a solution, if you add phosphorus to that solution, they're going to stick together and create gypsum and fall to the floor, making them not plant available. So instead of somebody telling you like, oh, you need more CalMag in your solution, helping them understand how calcium actually works within a chemical solution gives them the understanding of why their plants might not be calcium, or might be calcium deficient, and adding more calcium to the reservoir isn't helping your problem. It's only exacerbating it, right? And these are the ways that I found my successes in the garden. And I would voraciously read every peer-reviewed paper I could. The deeper I got into each function. Like I said, there was a point where I became almost obsessively exploratory about cation anion balance, and how nutrient compositions were formulated, and understanding how those things interact together, and why would we put chlorine in our water? That's crazy talk. But turns out all of these things have chemical basis and chemical foundation that span back 100 years of agriculture. We're just applying them to what we're trying to do.
Right. To our magical plant.
Some of the we have to give credit, I guess, to the people who figured a lot of this stuff out anecdotally without access to the information, and that is a lot of the the grow house guys and the Emerald Triangle guys who were doing it guerrilla style. I give them a lot of flack, because a lot of that community refuses to advance forward, despite the fact that science has come such a long way. We're doing a lot of the resting on our laurels deal. But the fact of the matter is they figured it out without having any of these tools available to them, whether they understood what they had figured out or not. And I think that's where a lot of the bro science comes from. A lot of these myths come from, is that, well, these guys did something that worked in 1999 compared to what we were doing in 1999. And they attributed their success to X, Y, and Z, flushing it with ice or whatever the case is. And the fact of the matter is, those weren't inherently what were responsible for their successes, but the way the environment, mitigated some of those crazy things that they were doing, because it was such a perfect environment. So whether we're introducing things that that have been done for forever or not, we've been figuring out these things for a long time, but now we've got the evidence to either say, well, yes, this one was true, this one isn't true. Like,
Well, so let's talk a little bit about experimental design then, because it sounds like you're one of the issues that you have with these older school thoughts of growing is that they would throw something at the plant, and if the plant did well that year, they'd say, well, that's what caused it. And then if they did it next year and something else happened, they'd say, oh, well, something else happened. I'm still applying this next year because it did it really good that one year. So, but with experimental design, a lot of that needs to be that you're making sure that it's not some external factor that's causing the change and then being misattributed to whatever that experimental design is. So what are some of the things that you've done in your garden where you put together a plan of being like, this is the thing that I'm changing? And
so
where did you see that it like succeeded in what you were hoping for?
the two biggest ones that we'll call it three. One of the things I guess I'm most famous for is my drying protocol. It was pretty controversial when I first started talking about it, but as people started digging into the science, the more people felt comfortable trying to implement it, the more feedback I started getting that this is game changing. I've never seen anything like it. And so that goes directly towards what we were talking about initially, is that the 60-60 drying principle comes from that era where, this is the best we could basically achieve, right? We could hang it where we could hang it in hiding, and this got us close. And the problem is that, like I said, we were attributing sort of accidental success, or not even success, coming close to success with success, because it was better than the failures we were seeing outside of that realm. The problem is it doesn't, 60-60 doesn't follow the logic that they're trying to employ implementing a 60-60 drying technique. And what I mean by that is, by leaving a plant on the rack for an X amount of days, it doesn't follow a linear drying path, right? We have to bring in the principles of thermodynamics and water adhesion, and the fact that at a certain point, the vapor pressure is going to overcome the water adhesion factor and break that chain. So now we're pulling, where at first we were pulling water from the middle of the flower through water adhesion. This water droplet was pulling the one in the middle closer to the surface. At some point, the vapor pressure is going to overcome that water adhesion, and that chain's going to break. And now we're left with water slowly in the middle of the flower, not being pulled out by that surface water anymore. That surface water exits the flower. It feels crumbly and dry outside, even after 2 days or whatever, right? And then we leave it again. The water in the middle starts to slowly diffuse back outwards. And eventually, over 14 days, we get to near, or hopefully near, an acceptable water activity. The problem with leaving it on the rack for 14 days is once that chain in the middle breaks and we're left with that water sitting, that's like a 30 or 40% moisture content inside an organic material over the course of the next 10 days. What is that the best environment for that you've ever heard? Right? Mold loves to grow in moist, dank environments that sit for 10 days. What I looked at was how do we achieve a linear dry? So the same rate of evaporative drying over a linear amount of time. And what that means is that we have to do drying in two phases, right? One's got to be our normal dry, and then once that chain breaks, we have to kick up the vapor pressure in order to pull that water out faster to maintain that even drying rate, because the first phase is going to come out really quick. If we don't pull out that second phase at the same rate, we're going to be left with that sitting water. So I looked at every imaginable metric, all of the compiled data, and we looked at what temperature degradation to terpenes did at a certain value over a certain amount of time. And what was found was that temperature to a certain point has negligible effect on terpene degradation. And they looked at something like 32 different terpenes. Between 4 degrees Celsius and 42 degrees Celsius, the loss of terpenes for every 10 degrees was something like 2% or whatever, and we can go back and look at my study. I've got it all referenced there. Negligible, basically, versus the degradation loss we saw at 60 degrees temperature over the course of 2 weeks, which is nearly a 30% loss in terpenes, just sitting on the rack. So that tells us no matter what we do, the longer we leave a plant hanging on the rack to dry, the lower those secondary metabolite numbers are going to be. The quicker we can get it off the rack, the faster we can get it down to our safe AW and into our preservative conditions, the higher those numbers are going to be. So that one took a significant amount of trial and experimentation and going against the grain, right? I got called crazy. I enjoy your hay, blah, blah, blah. But we can go back now and we can review everybody. Like people are doing this in 100 lighters. I've never seen a single person come back with negative feedback on that protocol specifically. And I take pride in the fact that, I dug up as much of the evidence of it as I could. I tried to put it into a digestible, readable format that was accessible to everybody. But at the end of the day, I didn't invent it. It's just what physics says is the way it should be done, right? It's not some magical discovery by me. The principles of diffusion are there. Like they're just sitting right there waiting to be applied to your plant because we've been doing it a way that kind of worked 40 years ago.
Sure. Yeah, it's like a 60-60 is kind of where you want it to be at, right, as you're bucking it off the plant. But you don't want to sit there to get there. And so we also have, in certain commercial settings, one of the things that I've ran into is that your drying room is the same as your storage room. And so temperature there then is extremely important. So what we found is we just drop it down to a really low relative humidity at 60 or 55 degrees and leave it
until
there
you get
until
your
it's at
AW.
the acceptable water activity. Absolutely. And then from there, we just slowly raise it back up, and works great. Usually everything's done in about still 12 days, but it is hard in certain aspects.
But I think the way you're doing it is significantly more beneficial than well, we can't hit those targets, so we'll just leave it on as long as we can get it out because it's low and slow or whatever the case is.
No.
Being able to, that goes into the other huge misconception about what is curing. And a lot of people have this very, very romanticized idea about what curing is. And without having an understanding, and I don't think the industry yet clearly has a good understanding of what they're trying to accomplish when curing. And it's not this fabled magic elixir that we're going from, product A to product 12. We're like not changing the constitution of what it is we're growing. And I think understanding that curing has many different forms depending on what we're trying to apply to. Is it wine? Is it wood? Is it cheese? Is it concrete? Is it resin? So all these things mean different things. And I think when we're looking at curing dried flower, what that means to me is we got our flower down to a safe water activity, but we still have that problem where the water's not evenly diffused throughout that entire flower, right? There's pockets of moisture here, and some are drier here and here. So when we get that flower into a jar or into a cure container or a cure space that's at so atmospheric equilibrium or vapor pressure equilibrium equals water activity, right? So if we can get our equilibrium to 64% humidity in our cure jar, close it down to the point where that vapor pressure only pulls the water to equilibrium to the point where, there's no longer force acting on the flower. The water is going to distribute to the surface. Everything's going to be exactly evenly distributed, and our flower is going to be one homogeneous moisture content. And that's all we're trying to achieve. If we have to burp it and let moisture out because it keeps climbing higher than our relative equal humidity, that means we didn't hit our safe water activity target. So
you're still drying.
It's just curing should simply be the final extension of drying, where we're trying to reconstitute the homogeneity of the moisture content of the flower. We're not doing this. It's breaking down this and it's breaking down that. That's going to happen over the course of weeks, along with your secondary metabolites, along with the fats, the lipids, the chlorophyll molecules, which will, the more of those unwanted pigments and stuff that we allow in a preservative condition to sort of degrade naturally on their own, we're also going to lose terpenes and cannabinoids and flavonoids. We're losing all of those things as well. But because it's not as adulterated with some of the compounds that were still in there, the chlorophylls, the fats, the alcohols, the ethanols, we're going to perceive the flavor palette of what we do have left as much more refined and much more palatable. So that's where I think the notion that, a long 4-week cure makes it taste better. The count is inarguably less than it was 4 weeks ago when it might have tasted grassier, but it's also a little bit more refined because we've eliminated some of those other things as well.
Right. It makes me think as though there's kind of, and there's just hearing you talk about it made me think about this, but it's almost like there's two different thresholds that you're kind of aiming for. And one of them is the mold operational threshold, where you're getting a water activity below this operational threshold so that the mold will not sporulate it, or it shouldn't, unless you have some sort of random humidity spike event
Right.
or something like that. And then you get into the enzymatic operational water activity zone. So all your enzymes can continue what they're doing there. And then below that, that's where a lot of people will over dry and they'll still have that hay smell, and they're like, but I dried it all the way. And it's like, well, you need to allow for the enzymes to operate. You need to allow for the breakdown and the homogenizing of moisture and for all of these other things to occur that are still occurring in this. And that's the cure.
Right. So, and
like
what's so important about that, that is that, having a water activity below a certain threshold, we still need that moisture, which still leaves the potential for that water's not bound. That water is available for any cellular organism to use for their needs, including mold spores. The goal here is that if we get it below that acceptable threshold, it's not nearly enough bound water to compete with the enzymes that are still actively working to do those biological functions, right? And this is going to keep the CFU far below even a registerable amount, hopefully zero, which it never is, but it's all a matter of water competition, and the enzymes are always going to outcompete a foreign organism for that unbound water within the flower. So as long as we're within a safe range, like you said, we're now out of the danger zone where colony forming units start to propagate, and we're still within that cell. The cells are hydrated enough to the point where there is that enzymatic activity, and there is cellular breakdown of various pigmentations and the remaining chloroplasts that are left in there, which, like I said, while degrading the secondary metabolite count, it's also reducing that unwanted adulterant in your plant. So,
right.
It's a matter of, you could have your quote unquote 34% THC right off the plant, but at the same time, it is going to taste better once it's down to 22%, but still has 4% terpenes and none of the other, or much fewer of the other compounds that we end up tasting.
Absolutely, it's very similar to like curing meats or pickles, where you're aiming for a specific water activity within these brines or salt packs or other things like that, where then you're allowing for specific bacteria or specific microbes to operate.
Cheeses specifically.
Yeah, absolutely, with cheeses as well. And then other things to not operate within that because the salinity is too high. And when we say salinity is too high, it's because that affects the water activity within that product. So it's curing is curing all the way around.
Well, and you brought up such a good point that I think we both skipped over a little bit, is that the people complain about this hay smell and they'll attribute it to either being a salt grow or. I can say with confidence that 99.9% of the time this happened in your dry or cure phase, and it's either that you undershot your AW target during the dry, you came in with your lights on. So one of the funny things that happens that people don't realize is they'll chop down their plants, they'll hang it up, and then they'll come in with their grow lights blasting and take their videos and stuff for 2 days of the upside down plants hanging. That plant basically has no idea that you chopped it down, especially in the first 2 days when the water content in that plant is 80% and all the cellular functions are still happening like plants are on, right? And as soon as you flip those lights on, the chloroplasts flip over and they're like, oh, time to photosynthesize again. So we've been here for, chlorophyll will break down. It's been shown in rice over the course of 3 days of darkness, it'll break down to next to nothing. And the plant will have no ability to photosynthesize past that 3 days of darkness. But the instant you turn the light on above 4 UMOL, it's like, hello, waking up. And as long as there's moisture content within those cells to complete that Kelvin cycle, it's going to start taking in those photons and producing more chlorophyll to do that again and again. So by the end of week 2 or whatever of your 60-60 dry, and you take it off, and it smells like I'm smoking grass. And that's because we got to our dry period, but you kept turning the lights on. It kept producing chlorophyll that we were trying to eliminate in the first place. And by the time that water activity was so low, it could no longer break that down into CFC blues. And now that's all you taste is green.
Yep.
And
wow,
it's
that's a really good point, and I don't think a lot of people think about that. But
absolutely.
That's a really wonderful point.
It's those little things, like, it's the drying part is everybody thinks they got to the end now and we'll just hang it up and then I'll get to smoke it. But this is like the critical part in my opinion, is getting it down to our acceptable AW as quickly as we can, and then getting it to the right preservative conditions as quickly as we can. It's not a matter of I didn't flush for 2 weeks, which it's simply a matter of understanding what the plant is going through in those last couple of days while it's trying to, while it's basically trying to survive, and it's sending out all sorts of crazy signals to try and do things. And the deeper we understand that on a cellular level, like I said, I had to read papers on how chloroplasts behave in the dark in order to understand that. But once I did, now I understood that, during those first 3 days, my plants are actually still alive, and they're behaving accordingly, right? Including with transpiration, other than the fact that we're eliminating the vascular aspect of being able to take up water. They're still sweating it out. They're still trying to photosynthesize, and they're still very much utilizing the molecules they've got within their structure to complete those functions.
I definitely smoke somebody's first grow who knew how to cure it well. Even if it was the airiest, larfiest, weirdest end product, but then they dried it and cured it well, and it didn't have terrible haze smell or anything like that to it. And if it was, crumbly like kinetic sand and not overly dried, and I would still for sure give it a try. But
absolutely.
I've had plenty of people be like, oh, this is, my 10th, 12th, however many, tens of grows they've done.
They just keep missing that one part.
And it's the dry and the cure always that it seems like you can just really ruin the best of products. So yeah, that's a very, I feel like that's huge. And I could see how that could make sort of it can demystify a lot of this stigma about like bad bud or
yeah, and
who grows well or whatnot.
I think I found it's also open people's perspectives who were like dead set against salt growing, because that was their experience, is that every time they smoked something from their buddy who grows with salt, it tastes disgusting, but they get organic from the dispensary and it tastes and they seem to conflate those two things as being an issue, and that sets them off growing in a salt-based system simply because they think that's what their end result's going to be. I hear the same thing with Athena all the time, like, oh no, Athena's cardboard or whatever. And the fact of the matter is that can be very true, but it's not because of the reason people think it is. And this leads into my other one. You ever heard the the bro science myth, cut out nitrogen in late flower, just cut it out. So there's actually huge validity to that. The problem is the way these nutrient companies formulate their nutrients. One, there's endless data to show that high amounts of NH4 in any capacity will absolutely fuck up your plant's secondary metabolite count. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. All of the better nutrient companies will have a blend of NH4 plus and non-nitrate nitrogen, because the plant likes a combination of both specific nitrogen molecules in order to optimize the uptake. The thing is, over a certain value, we see the secondary metabolite and cannabinoid production drop unfathomably. So you go from something like 60 micro milliliters per liter or whatever, and you see a sharp drop of 30% reduction in secondary metabolites, all the way up to a 60% reduction in secondary metabolites. Whereas if we start to show a nitrogen deficiency, this causes a stress response in the plant to produce secondary metabolites. So simply by finding a way to manipulate your specific nutrient regimen to reduce the amount of nitrogen post-bulking, once your plants have finished setting their flowers, put on as much mass as they can, we want to shut that nitrogen number down to as much as we can, if zero, because we've still got a lot of it built up inside the root zone. The problem is that we can't necessarily just like cut out, let's call it advanced nutrients A or whatever, because that's got your cal nitrate. So now you're cutting out calcium, magnesium, nitrogen, zinc, boron, all of the micros that we're going to do. So I found that by playing with specific nutrient ratios and mixes, particularly by slowly tapering down on bloom and introducing fade at the same time with Athena, which isn't part of the program, I'd been able to see a huge increase in secondary metabolite production, to the point where Athena's chemists had reached out and asked me to sort of help drive their SOP changes in that regard. So like it's little, there are little things that we can do that will absolutely change the way our gardens perform from the last run, with just a little alteration, right? As to how we apply those nutrient ratios, or how we dry our plants in 10 days less than we ordinarily would, or how we implement the Emerson effect during flower. Those type of things, those three things in particular, have been the biggest improvements to my garden. And as you know, the more experience you have, the less wide those increases feel, right? They become much more incremental increases in your improvement, because there's only so much more to understand, right? Every win is now just a micro win on top of something we already knew, right? So that's when like you start out, every improvement's this big massive leap, whereas now we're making these small incremental improvements to our processes. But those three that we just discussed moved me from a guy who grows flower to Sharkmouse Farms, as arrogant as that may come across. You know, I never intended to be that way, but I think my processes are revered for a specific reason. It's because I was willing to do that experimentation, and I wasn't bound by fiduciary responsibility to my shareholders, or an obligation to fulfill a specific quota of flower, or whatever the case is. I had enough room to be able to experiment and implement different scientific ideas and see what was most beneficial.
For sure. Well, let's kind of do a little thought experiment then, and run. So since you haven't really been growing for flower for a few months now, run us through your final iteration that you did run. what was your what were some of the different parameters and set points that you shot for, just so that people can kind of get a picture of what you were doing in that
Right. So
final iteration.
so we went for a bit of a turn and burn. I would have my clones rooted and into the blocks within 7 days, and once they went into the blocks, I'd water those 1 gallon blocks. I'll calculate the best way to figure out how big your media should be in your space is to figure out what your overall canopy size is going to end up being in that space, and from there we can calculate the expected water loss volume through transpiration, which will give you an idea of how much water you need to go through, giving you an idea of how big your media should be. In any case, I ended up running 26 1-gallon pots in that room, and I was putting on, for the most part, during most of the run, no more than 8 shots a day of irrigation. But the goal was to slowly stack up the EC from the moment those plants were rooted. I wanted to bring up the EC all the way up to its max point. I wanted to have my PPFD ready to go at 1200 PPFD from the moment I flipped in flower, stacked all the way up to 10 EC, and then drive that transition as hard as I could for the first 2.5 weeks. One of the things, so a couple of the things I implemented it to make that run as much of a success as it was to be able to, one, go into bulking at about day 17 instead of waiting till I got to day 24 or 25, which gave me a leg up. And by doing that, I was able to do that because I was able to start day one of flower at 1200 ppfd, pushing that high EC, already coming into a 25% overnight dryback. So those first 3 weeks are critical, and you can't go back and fix them. It's all about setting the flowers in place and getting that plant's physiology into a hormonal shift where it's going anyways, but we got to push it into that flowering shift as quickly as possible. And by applying as much targeted stress onto the plant as we can during those first 3 weeks, we're able to flip it over as quickly as we can, set those flowers, and then ease off the pressure as much as we can come bulking to allow it to just take up whatever it needs. The flowers are already set. They're already established as to what that entire cull is going to end up looking like. The plant isn't going back into a vegetative hormonal state. So now that we're already in a flowering hormonal state, we can ease off all that pressure and give it everything it wants from week 2.5 all the way to week 6, and just fill it up. And from there, I dropped the nitrogen right out. I starved it for nitrogen while still giving it really, and now I move back into a targeted stress phase where I'm giving it a really heavy dry back. I start to increase the VPD and really make that plant sweat in order to think, danger ahead, the end of my life is coming. I'd better do everything I can to build resinous flowers, throw out as many sigmas as I can to try and collect some pollen, which I'm not going to let it do, obviously. So it's just going to keep stacking those calyxes on top of one another. And the end result, by implementing those 3 specific strategies that together, was minimal. We'll call it minimal yield dilution. And what I mean by that is, generally it's either all the plant spends as much of its resources building biomass, which takes away from its ability to create those secondary metabolites that we're after, those volatile oils that we're after, those trichomes that we're after, or we stress it so hard that it spends all of its energy producing those protectants that are the main function of the trichomes, and it doesn't have the energy necessary to divide that into additional biomass. Implementing some of these cues, like I said, being able to transition it from transition to bulking quicker due to the Emerson effect, and pushing on and letting off of the targeted stress at specific implemented times allows you to sort of walk that line where you can build up the biomass of the plant before allowing it to pack on all of those secondaries that we're after. So the biggest takeaway for me is that we're in a fluid system here, right? And it's never, week 1, this is what we're doing. Week 2, this is what we're doing. Week 3, this is what we're doing. We're following what the plant is naturally doing, and we're optimizing and tailoring it to that plant's physiology for the best outcome.
What were some of your EC targets, as well as like temperatures and humidities throughout this run?
So a big thing is people like to, and we discussed this with the drying thing, is that terpenes evaporate at 77 degrees or whatever the case is, and this is true to an extent. Off gassing happens, but this is occurring in environments from ambient, 68 degree temperature all the way up to 100 degree temperature. I think the key here is to ensure that your VPD is acting as an agent for your water potential. So when we talk about understanding VPD, it's doing so in the context of knowing how that's impacting how the plant is pulling water. So if I'm driving a really high EC that's going to be pulling a lot of water, I need to understand what that's going to be doing to the osmotic pressure and the PWEC in my root zone. And I'm going to have to adjust all of those metrics in unison so that they all fit one another accordingly. During transition, like I said, I was pushing really hard. I wanted to see a minimum of 6 EC at the root zone to a peak of 10 EC, just as I started introducing those first P1s over the course of the day. And as I'd get to that peak EC, especially during transition, I would be pushing very minimal, if any, runoff just to maintain that 10 EC the whole ride through. Now, when we talk about getting to bulking, I'm slow. I'm not now starting to push 20% runoff on every irrigation to try and bring that down. What I'm doing is I'm slowly reducing that osmotic pressure day over day, just so it's lower than it was the day before. That way, it's like working out with a barbell, right? And then putting that barbell down and picking up a pencil. All of a sudden, the pencil feels like nothing, right? If day 1, my PWC's at 10, and then the next day with a little bit of runoff, I bring it down to 9.5, that pencil is going to feel a little bit lighter. I'm going to be able to pull up more nutrients. I'm going to be able to bulk higher. So the goal is to ride that peak EC through transition. And then when I get into bulking day over day, bring it back down to that 6 number, but not all the way down, because once bulking is done and we go into ripening, I got to scale it all the way back up again. So we're riding.
And were you doing this with a 3.0 EC input?
Yep.
Okay. And do you run that all the way from veg through flower as well as fade?
So I'll get my EC up from clones. So I'll start my clones out at 2 EC, and I'll allow them to start to work the PWC up as they root into the blocks. And as they do, I'm slowly increasing my input EC, because I'm only getting 10% drybacks in those first 2 weeks of veg, right? So I can safely increase the input EC while not worrying about overdoing the PWEC. And as soon as we flip and I start to see those 15, 20, 25% drybacks, I don't have to worry about climbing up the EC because I'm already there. And now I'm just worrying about the PWEC as managed through my drybacks.
Got it. Yeah, no, I mean, I like to ask because some people will try to manipulate it through raising or lowering their input. But I like to say, it's really more about raising or lowering your volume just to make sure that you hit runoff. Yeah, I got mine up here too.
I've been seeing them floating around. They're saying hi.
But it's like all the things that you can keep consistent without having to chase something is really important.
So one of the cool little papers I stumbled upon while trying to understand photosynthetic sealing was a concept called photoplasticity. And this allowed me to get to my peak ppfd for day one of flower without having to go into flower and scale it up from 600 to 1,000. And what we all do, and what we've all always done, is we've slowly increased our light intensity in increments. Week over week, we'll go from 90 ppfd to 250 to 450 to 650. And what's happening is somewhere in that day where you're increasing the light, your plant's hitting its DLI max, and it can't take any more light in. It just doesn't have the capacity to do it. And now we start a process of photo inhibition. So whether that's 12 hours into the day, 14 hours into the day, 16 hours into the day, there's this block of time where your plant's being smashed with light and it can't absorb it, and it's creating reactive oxygen species just to try and mitigate some of that damage, right? So right there, we're now, so that's creating, chlorosis and yellowing and all sorts of other problems that's bringing down that photosynthetic ceiling. So the next day we're going to increase the increment, but we've actually reduced the amount that plant's capable of photosynthesizing.
Right.
And we find ourselves, so I don't know, I'm going to keep my light at 450 for 2 weeks till it catches up or something. And we find ourselves losing a lot of time. If we go day one at 120 ppfd, and then the next day we bring it back down to 90, your plant has had the ability to take in all those photons, but then we've given it a chance to sit back, relax, regenerate with the understanding that light is a possibility now. So it's got that reservoir filled, but we're not overloading it because now it's kicking back on an easy day. And then the next day we go up to 200 ppfd, and it's like, a little bit stronger, but it has that capacity. And we come back the next day down to 120, and we let it ease off a little bit. Then the next day we're at 350, and we keep staggering our approach upwards, and that continuously pushes the physiology of the leaf's photosynthetic capability higher while not overloading it, and we're not compounding this photo inhibition problem day over day over day. And what we see is that by the time we go from week one, where we're at 90 ppfd, we're in week 3 now, and we're at 1,200, and the plant's asking for more and more and more and more and more, right? So we can go ahead and flip day one, not losing a single day, pushing the plant as hard as it can. We're on a clock, right? We have 55 to 70 days to flower. If we're spending the first 2 weeks coming up from 450 ppfd trying to hit our max during transition, when we're really trying to push that plant hard, we're really behind the 8 ball now. You understand, right?
Yep.
So we
Absolutely.
can save ourselves that whole process just by getting it done in veg. That way, the day we flip, we're already where we need to be. We don't even have to touch our lights anymore.
Nope. I mean, I really like that approach. I've used the approach of not doubling, but increasing by half the ppfd day one of flower, because you lose a third of your DLI by going from 18 to 12. And so just by doubling it, your ppfd at canopy, you hit the same DLI pretty easily that way. But you can, in certain cultivars, run into some huge stress factors of them not being able to photosynthesize at that same rate. But some plants, they just go right into it and they're fine with it as long as everything else is locked in.
People tend to focus a lot on ppfd while ignoring DLI as a greenhouse metric, right? When in fact it's the most important metric we should be measuring when we're talking about light, because your plants are only capable of eating so much light in a day, right? And understanding that metric will go in veg. A lot of people tell me, I hate veg, flower so much easier. Chances are you're overloading your plant with lights in veg, and that's why they look sad and purple and whatever. You're sitting here dumping on all these amendments and fixes and flushing it and drying it out, and turn down the light like a little bit and you'll see it bounce back to happy as can be, because we're not paying attention to what 18 hours of photons radiating a leaf does versus 12.
Absolutely. No, I feel like there are a lot of oversights within home growers, and just like what you were talking about earlier, how there's just so much of this stuff that was bro science or because they told me so and it works. And now there's the ability to apply a more scientific lens, as well as just have a little bit more access to information that is well formulated, and it doesn't rely on because someone told you so. It'll tell you why it works, and you can look into those processes and be like, oh, well, this happens for all plants, or this happens for all cellular respiration, or this is, there's a lot of things like
So
that
what's
where
super,
it
I
helps
had
create a
somebody
holistic approach.
I did one of my drying posts where I tried to get the information about what I was trying to educate people on, and one of the things, you referenced a paper on rice. Rice isn't cannabis, and it was directly discussing how chlorophyll behaved in the dark, and I had referenced this paper to you earlier,
Right.
and the fact of the matter is chlorophyll, and it's going to do what chlorophyll does in the presence of either light or dark. It's a molecule that's evolved a very specific function, whether it's in a tomato or it's in rice or it's in cannabis or it's in algae. It has a specific inherent function that doesn't negate its purpose simply because it doesn't fit your ideology, right?
Right. It's like we don't know that these different terpenes oxidize at different temperatures because we took cannabis-derived terpenes and oxidized them. These are the same terpenes that you find everywhere else. And we have plenty of data from 100 years ago plus on oxidation rates for different
Go look at a
terpenes.
paper on hops. It'll tell you everything you need to know.
Exactly. And so a lot of this stuff that is, like I said earlier, people think cannabis is this special magical plant. And while there are aspects of it that I will not deny are pretty darn cool and not really necessarily found in a lot of other places on Earth, it's still a plant and it still does what plants do. And so
I don't know if you saw my op-ed post I did a few days ago, but I ended it with a little tongue-in-cheek sort of quip saying, if you want verified data, go follow a tomato farmer, because they don't do anything that doesn't work. There's too much money they've invested. There's too much risk stake in the game that if it doesn't work, the SOP is eliminated. And if it works, we're using it, plain and simple. There's not
it's
none
like
of the
it's like the generative vegetative cycles of crop steering. It's like that is not at all even close to something that cannabis started with. This is what greenhouse vine tomato
in the
growers have been
70s.
doing for centuries, not centuries, decades. Sorry,
That's what I mean. Like,
but they've
this is what I'm saying. Like, there are papers from 1977 expressing how a generative Q through high EC can increase the sugar content of your tomato. Right? Like, it's not new. We just like, oh, this works too.
Yeah, it's like you go to a tomato farmer and you show them a dosatron, and they're going to be like, "Yeah, I have like 30 of those."
You know, been using them.
Yeah, it's really silly to think that like because it's implemented in cannabis that it is the first of any kind. It's it's all just plants, and we've understand a lot of the aspects of how plants work for quite some time. And so looking at those other aspects, like I said, with like plant empowerment or books like hydroponic food production, all these different things that are really well written. They give a lot of great information, but are not at all directly talking about cannabis.
Soil food web, great one.
Exactly. Especially, yeah, if you're going towards like a salt-based feed, I would say like hydroponic food production, soil food web, if you're going for something where you want to understand the different components of the soil and how those are going to break down the inputs that you're putting in that aren't readily available to plants. All these different things are well known and understood. And I mean, there's still parts of them that are still being discovered, but I wouldn't say cannabis growers are the ones doing the discovery.
No, absolutely. And that's so bang on, is that like there's very, very little left for us to eureka the agricultural world about. They're all sitting back like, oh, welcome, young nephew. Like, come on in. We've been here a while. Like, you know what I mean? It's we if we recognize that, we can utilize their experience to our advantage, and a lot of us are missing that one.
It's like triploid and polyploid breeding, and everyone's like, oh, look how cool this is, and it's like Monsanto enters the chat. Get real. We've known about
so
this.
You're telling me it won't reproduce, but we can still get the monetary value off it. We've been invested. Thank you.
Yeah, we've been invested in that. Yeah, exactly. So, well, let's go into a little bit of what you're doing now currently. We touched on it briefly at the beginning, but like run a little bit of like through your process. You've created a really good egress point to your sterile workspace, and you have some other cool things that you're working on in there. So why don't you just talk about it for a bit?
So, like I said in the beginning, I think I'm noticing a paradigm shift in the industry. We've got pathogens just running rampant and pervasively intervening on our market to the point where we're seeing widespread damage and near destruction of whole crops. And um, I I think the number was somewhere like 66% of uh, all plant samples tested from a litany of facilities and distributors had all tested for HLV, and I think that we're only going to see that problem get worse and worse and worse. And I think with tissue culture being inherently um, the solution to that specific problem, in the sense that with scalability doesn't come the same problems as we see with cultivation scalability, right? You can keep an entire mother room of phenos. The more plants you have in there, the higher your increased risk of pathogen infection becomes. Scalability and labor costs on keeping that R&D room up and running is becoming more and more exponential every day. And as I've shown proof of concept, and as tissue culture, the industry itself is showing repeatedly, when you can scale an entire 1,000 light grow room with 4,000 plants from a single 400 square foot lab, with minimal overhead costs, next to no maintenance costs, and no maintenance labor, that's just a no-brain move. So I think for me, what I'd like to do is I'd like to start an elite, clean, sterile genetics library that's just always available and on stock for the breeders themselves specifically. I don't want to have, this won't be a public clone bank or anything, but what it will be is a safe, clean repository for the storage of breeder specific hunted phenotypes. And what I aim to be is the go-to place for ensuring that the preservation of those lineages going forward. And it won't be a single serve operation where it's meant to preserve my genetics, or I'd like to be the Norwegian seed vault of cannabis genetics. And
For sure.
I think that with my positioning in the market and my relationships with a lot of great breeders, my propensity to get the things I'd like to get and do the things I want to do in life, I'm confident that I'll be able to build into that. So what I'm doing now is I'm starting off now. I've got all of Pheno Hunter Green Lab Genetics new feminized line. He did a collaboration with Flavor Genetics, and I've got their entire line backed up on my shelf now. We're going to be doing rooted plantlets. I'll send a bunch back to him. A couple of the rooted plantlets we're going to harden and run in my space as well, and try and collect a couple of phenotypes back off of those. And in doing so, I'm going to advertise that other geneticists and breeders that would like to partake in the program, that it'll be a easily accessible, send in your sample. I'll have it ready to go. When you have a room, say you need 2,500 plants, you give me 2 weeks notice, I get you 2,500 plantlets ready, ship them out in a box, and your room is ready to go. So I think the turnaround time for these facilities and these breeders to get from order to room filled with rooted plantlets is game changing as far as reducing their overhead costs.
Yeah, we just did an episode with Jesse Locke from I think it's Jesse Locke from Mothership Labs, and they do tissue culture services, and he was showing us in the background of he had to run out to Florida to a facility that does 5 million explants a year, and it was it's very impressive and it's a lot of work, but the maintenance on it is where I feel like the win is, because you have such reduction in maintenance overall, reduction
square
in
footage,
inputs,
overhead operational costs,
everything, where it does become this sort of like it could be a secret tool to help a lot of even the small mom and pop grows.
Well, and I think I think genetic consistency in your end product, right? Like if you as a consumer go to the dispensary for a certain product and you get that product and I love it and I'm going back to get that one, but the next bag came from a different plant that's a slightly different chemovar simply because of abiotic factors that occurred 10 tables down, right? That's altering your customer's experience either for the better or for the worse. There is zero genetic drift from a propagation perspective that we would see with ordinary cloning, because especially if we're doing meristem, it's non-vascular cellular propagation, meaning it's happening so fast that there's little chance for those allelial mutations to occur in such a small space of time. So every single plant is every single genetic identical, which is
Right?
huge
I mean,
when you're running a room of 1,000 plants.
I think about it for the applications in phenohunting, especially when you see that,
You've got a keeper, you want it to be your keeper.
yeah, and the upkeep on, 1,000 plant phenohunt, let's say, that means you need 1,000 clones of it going, or 1,000 moms, and then
You're watering all of them.
watering, lighting, everything
Default,
that goes
trim,
into
like
it.
everything.
I
You
already
got to
think
heat
about
them.
it, and it's a headache. But if I have one single, um, 48 by 72 by 18 rack with 5 or 6 shelves on it with minimal lighting, just go with like clone lighting or something, you could have 10,000 different explants on there. And so it's,
And from those 10,000 explants, right, I can subculture 50,000 subcultured plantlets, right? And then those 10,000 plantlets I'll either make more explants or we'll let them reshoot, and there's another 50,000 more in 2 weeks. So it's infinite plants for minimal square footage, which is the name of the game, right? When we look at our overhead costs, especially as they scale up, any area you can reduce, especially your energy input costs like this, when you can go from a 4,000 square foot mom room down to, like I said, a 400 square foot shelving unit, then you're saving yourself 300 grand a year.
yeah, easily on the electrical alone. Yeah,
And in this climate, how do you argue that, really?
it's really hard to, especially considering how the market demand changes on a weekly basis for what flavor people want on the shelf. And so in order to be able to anticipate what that, you need to have a huge library to select from.
We've gone into this fun bloodletting era of the industry where we're no longer a cash crop. You're an agricultural commodity that's unsubsidized. Corn's got a leg up on you, big guy. So you gotta make that those savings where you can get them.
Yeah, we can't even row crop with seeds.
Yeah, that's
Like
what I mean.
that.
Like
Yeah,
we're so hindered and so handcuffed by not only legislation but the market cap based on supply and demand that if you really want to lose 100 grand because you wanted to keep a couple of moms around, it just seems fiduciarily irresponsible.
right. Absolutely. Well, I feel like you've pivoted a few times just to make sure that you stay ahead of the curve. So you might be one of the perfect people to ask. And you could approach this in either of two ways. What do you feel you see changing in the cannabis industry coming up, or what would you like to see changed in the cannabis industry? And you can tackle those together or separately or just one or the other.
We're heading for a reckoning one way or another, whether I like it or I don't like it. The genetic dilution we've seen from just years of unregulated pollen chucking has been detrimental. There's no way around it. The variety with which we're accustomed to now is one thing, but you get this sense that we've lost something along the way, right? With every new cake with every new Zittles this and candies that. everything starts to become a little more blended, a little less unique, a little less defined. Um, Frankly, what I see happening is the closer we get to normalizing genetic sequence editing, the better off we'll all be, frankly. And I know that sounds like a scary, you referenced Monsanto earlier, and I know that sounds, it's a big, scary, evil word. But when we think of GMO, we only hear like the boogeyman speak, and not some of the benefits available through being able to moderate what it is we're trying to accomplish. Like I said, we're seeing a massive problems with pathogens. We're seeing huge problems with um, um, uh, genetic and fallacies. Like there's just so much looseness, and not enough structure to preserve what it is we're all so passionate about, right? I think if we can get to a point where we've got plants that we can make resistant to specific pathogens, and we can express specific dominant traits to better suit what it is our customers are after. At the end of the day, this isn't about like a dick measuring contest, or I'm the best grower because I know how to do it naturally. At the end of the day, we're just trying to provide the best product to our consumer. And if we can do that with the computer, then I'm for it. And I think, while monopolizing an entire agricultural industry because you're the most powerful company on earth has its ethical issues, I don't think that's a necessary intrinsic inherency that comes along with gene editing or sequencing our food, or any of the technological advances we're capable of achieving, just because it's used for nefarious purposes in some instances, right? I think that
technology is not evil inherently. It's all about the people using it.
Absolutely.
That then turn it into something that it wasn't either intended for. But, part of the responsibility of even like the creation of these new technologies and applications and stuff is trying to forecast what some of those end uses might be.
Who's in a position to leverage those over what your ideology would suppose it would, versus what the reality of the situation is, right? Like at the end of the day, do I have more money than say Monsanto to say I'll go and edit and patent it? No, they'd probably just steamroll me, take the patent, do it themselves. Hey, what a great idea. Look what we've just reintroduced. So that's obviously always a huge consideration, is the ethical responsibilities that come along with some of these discoveries and these advances. But at the end of the day, things move forward with or without us, right? And we'd rather be on the right side of it than the wrong.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. So with all of your experience as well, in terms of the different experiments that you've applied to your gardens, finding success in certain aspects, perhaps failures in other aspects, what are some of those pitfalls that you see growers face, maybe that you've faced yourself, that you would help caution new growers in?
So one of the biggest failing points that tends to be a really hard learning curve, despite how many years of experience you have in this field, tends to be this inclination to need to baby new plants. And it's always almost detrimental to the point where you're causing long-term issues that you're not going to be able to outrun simply by overwatering that little plantlet in your three-gallon pot that's got no roots, and you're just sitting there watering soil. And this happens repeatedly over and over and over, as it even happens with experienced cultivators who are, oh, I haven't watered it in 2 days, I'd better get on it. I'll tell you a secret. Until I see that true growth pressure start to drop and the leaves go, now you're thirsty. I know the roots are out there somewhere searching for water, but the entire goal of the first 2 weeks of that plant's life is to establish a strong, healthy, vigorous root zone. And the only way to do that is to make it go find water. Stop watering your young plants. They don't need it.
A lot of people won't believe me when I say that from transplant until flower, I probably water twice.
Me too.
And that's once at transplant.
Me too. Like, I'll saturate the blocks, I'll put it in, I'll water the thing in, and I'll see you in a week later.
Yep. Saturate again, and then usually
people are always very apprehensive about that. But as I've seen time and time and time again, setting them up strong with a strong foundation, a good vigorous root base, is the only way to ensure that they're going to be taking up the amount of water you're going to need to put on them in order to get the results you want to get.
Well, and the fertilizer blends are so much better nowadays than they used to be. That a big reason for these high porosity blends, where they would even take cocoa, add a little peat moss, and then a bunch of perlite and pumice and vermiculite to it, would be to increase the available air at field capacity, so that you could water every day, because you needed to replenish those nutrients that you watered the day before, because they were imbalanced going in, and they're even more imbalanced now that the plant's used what it wants.
Plants are taking up and leaving some behind. Plus, you're having these evaporative forces leaving salts behind that are only exacerbating what's now left in the root zone. And that's I try to show people what a VWEC and a PWEC graph look like in comparison with one another, and how those two lines interact as we both dry out our medium and reconstitute it with water, and adding additional ions into it once it's been dried back. And how a plant behaves at field capacity is vastly different from how it behaves at a dryback, right? Because it's got to do two entirely different things. But understanding how those things are working inside the cocoa itself is vastly more beneficial than just saying, okay, water at 2 EC until 10% runoff, because now you know what's happening when we're past that runoff part. Your plants haven't had water in 4 hours and have dried back now an additional 8%, and what's happening to our PWEC and what the plant is doing with the ions that were in there and now aren't. Like, there's so much going on, but at the same time, it's all relatively intuitive when you have the foundation to understand it.
It's like you don't need to necessarily explain how much runoff you need if you can explain to someone what that pore water electrical conductivity is doing to the plants and how you can manipulate it with runoff. Then they can make that decision themselves. Even if they can't read what's in the substrate, they can look at the plant and make some educated guesses, as well as the stage of life that the plant is in, and go, okay, so I want to make sure that the plant gets a little bit of stress early on. Lower your runoff. Well, I want less stress when it bulks. Increase your runoff. I want more stress at the end. Decrease your runoff. Like, there's simple things like that where it is hard to grasp the overall concept of crop steering.
So, but that's actually always my very first starting point, is when I'm doing consults or I'm educating people on my irrigation SOP. I say, let's not get stuck in the mud here. We're not going to get all to the every single detail and understanding how positive ions interact. We're not doing all that. Let's just do this. You have a little dial, and every time you turn the dial up, more water comes out of the bottom of the pot, and with that come out salts. And every time you dial it down, less come out, which make the salt in the pot increase. And the more they understand that you can see them visualizing in their head, okay, I need to do, and you can see them turning the dial. And now it's starting to make sense to them. So like you said, they don't necessarily need to understand the complexity behind what we're trying to express, just understanding the mechanics of the motion that occurs when we're implementing those things.
It's like providing the simplistic dichotomous key, where you have more stress or less stress. You can do that with more dry, less dry. You can do that with more EC, less EC. You can do that with
higher
more
vapor
light,
pressure,
less
lesser vapor pressure.
Exactly. So each one of those you can apply this dichotomous key to, so that they can say, okay, I just need to turn that dial in one direction.
Exactly.
I'm either increasing it or decreasing it. And then the complexity of it is when you're then the DJ and you're turning all the dials at once.
Yeah, pulling
right?
this lever, this one's going, but
Exactly.
you've already learned how to manipulate this lever, so it's not taking brain power to figure, okay, while I'm doing this needs to be in the down position because that makes
Right.
sense to me, right?
Right. And it is then correlating those different dials and how you turn it and how they affect the other dials and then how you need to adjust those, that I feel like a lot of people find the whole concept of crop steering starts to become a little more confusing. And that's where I feel like the learning curve lessens. You know, it can increase a lot just by understanding that all these different things can be turned towards one or the other. But then when you're saying, well, this applies to this applies to this, that's where it can then sort of start to get harder. But if you do
Muddled.
try to provide that holistic approach of saying, but this is all, like, you're all just looking at it from the plant's point of view as a water pump, trying to move nutrients.
Water's got to come up
provide
and it's
stuff.
got to get out.
So you gotta, if you try to start there and then be like, okay, like try to bring it back to that home base of this is what plants do. How do you apply these different things? If you get a little lost, just step back a little
Right
bit.
back to the last point, and we could
Right.
we'll call this a staggered learning approach. Like you'll never find me directing somebody in a, like I said at the beginning, in an A to B. Okay, we plant the seed and now we take it out of the paper towel and we go here. I'll give you a million different concepts, but by the time you're ready to use that concept in your garden, we'll have already talked about it, and you'll have you'll put your hands into it with that in the back of your head, and it won't feel so new
Right.
to you anymore, right?
Exactly. It does take a lot of experience to get that ease of motion in the garden, I would say.
Oh, absolutely.
But for a lot of people, it will come with time and with, listening to conversations like this. Hopefully it helps more people see that, you just, maybe there's a different thing, something that you're not thinking about that might come up that goes, oh, it clicks now. I know what they're talking about. That makes so much sense.
Or exactly. You had just gotten to that point in your journey where now it finally does make sense to you, despite having heard it a million times before, yapping from my mouth, talking about it over and over and over. But now you're finally there. You're at that point. You've progressed past all the other things I was talking about, and you're like, oh shit,
Right.
now I'm at this part where I got to start worrying about VWC. I remember he was telling me about that, and it's now less of a new door and that they've got to open, and more of a refresher. Like, oh, okay, so I remember him talking about this. That's what he was talking about. That makes sense to
Right.
me. So, and that's how I like to approach it.
It's really fun when you start to make all those connections because you can see how they tie in with each other, and it becomes almost like if you're a puzzler, it becomes this puzzle that you're
You
putting
get
the
the whole
pieces
border
in.
piece.
Yeah, and you get the border in, and you're like, all right, I got it from here.
Exactly what that's exactly how I feel about it. Like you sit there and I'll spend 3 hours. I'm trying to find the corner, but all of a sudden you got that one border piece in, and now pieces are just starting to fill in one by one by one by one, and it's starting to feel natural again, right? And that's, I push people out of where they were comfortable growing. Oh, I'm good. I've gotten harvest, and I push them out of that comfort zone until it's comfortable again. And now this is where your
Right.
comfort zone is, right? So we're just going to keep moving that goalpost for you.
Absolutely. Well, so what would then be what would be the first piece of advice you would give to any new grower?
So I like to think that understanding that concept that your whole goal is to fill the media with roots, as opposed to just allowing it to be empty media, will get you a really long way as a new grower. But my biggest piece of advice, like whether you've been growing for 3 years and you're just sort of meandering your way through and haven't seen very much progression, or this is your first ever grow, quite honestly, go crack open a grade 11 biology book, a grade 11 chemistry book, and just skim through some of the major concepts. Familiarize yourself with things that you thought were that you already knew. For example, everybody knows what photosynthesis is, right? But do you really know what photosynthesis is? Go familiarize yourself with things that you thought you already knew and don't need to know, and you'll be surprised how much information you're able to pull out of these these simple concepts. Like I said, when you dive deep into understanding that, yeah, plants eat sunlight, but when you understand how they do it and what's happening inside and where that energy goes and what you need to do to maintain that cycle, then all of a sudden you're like, you have a better understanding of why you need to, like, it eliminates so many different whys for you. So now I understand why I need a high ppfd proper spectrum grow light. Now I understand how water moves in the plant. And it's by understanding these core concepts that we didn't think we really needed to know because we're not in grade 11 high school anymore. You find that it eliminates a lot of the questions that are going to come up for you as you're progressing through this journey.
Absolutely. That, I don't think I could have said it better myself. It, building these foundations and then building upon those foundations, and, you know, always trying to bring yourself back to the basics if you can. If you start to feel yourself getting lost, it helps tremendously.
If you don't understand something, take it one step back. Where did we get lost?
Right.
Where was the last place I was comfortable? And let's go from there, and we keep working back. Problems are treasures, right? Like I said earlier, we have the ability to be wrong, which gives us the ability to be right about being wrong, right? We get to correct that and no longer be wrong about that thing. So if you're one of those people that just hates to be wrong and has to be right all the time, being wrong is good for you.
Right. Mistakes are only mistakes if you don't learn from them.
Precisely.
Yep. Well, you know, this has been a wonderful talk, and I just have a few little wrap-up questions for you that I like to ask everyone that comes on the podcast.
Sure.
So what's your favorite strain of all time?
So I had a Ken Estes original Granddaddy Purple that, I don't know if you remember, like, going to the grocery store or the toy store as a kid, and they had those balls that smelled like they were bouncy balls, and they smelled like lemon, cherry, fruit, watermelon, all those. They had like a really plasticky flavored smell. This smelled exactly like that grape ball. When you open the jar, you'd smell that like toy grape smell, and I can't get it out of my head. So that sticks out as like my favorite phenotype of all time. My favorite just general cultivar in general is Lamb's Breath. It's an older sativa that comes right out of Jamaica. I believe Bob Marley had something to do with it, but it's got this very, very gassy hydrocarbon diesel flavor to it. It's very hard to find nowadays. I chase it everywhere, but alas, no luck yet.
Oh man, that brings back memories. I'm from the Bay Area, and there's this dispensary that's been there forever, Harborside, and they used to get Ken Estes Granddaddy Purple grown by him back in like 08, 09 or something like that, and it was memorable to say the least.
It was the top shelf at the time for sure.
It was. And Lamb's Red too, or Lamb's Breath, you know, whichever one people are used to. That one, you know, I've heard stories of where it was just, that's what anything grown in an area was called if it came out of Jamaica. But a lot of it seemed very similar to me when I would try.
Yeah, so it all has this very I can't really pin the smell, but it's like it's like jet fuel, like a skunk fell into a jet fuel tank, and it's very, very, you open it and you're like, yeah, that's the guy for sure, and it must be the terroir on those Jamaican hillsides if that's what's coming out. But you know, again, with tissue culture, one of the main benefits is some of the genetic refreshing that can be done. And if anybody's got any of those land races laying around, I'm happy to take a sample and bring it back to its vigorous life.
Nice. That's awesome. Well, so of course, to follow up favorite strain, as a grower, if you had to reach for a pack of seeds, what breeder are you reaching for?
So obviously, I've got a couple of favorites that I've run with for a while. Green Lab Genetics, where he's a good friend of mine, but he's an exceptional breeder with a great eye. That being said, you know, Relentless Genetics just puts in. We're not even particularly friends. We used to have a pretty close working relationship. Whatever happened, I guess. But that takes away nothing from his skill, his attention to detail, and his diligence as a breeder. Not everybody is willing to put in the work necessary to get such uniformity and consistency out of the top level work that they do. But Relentless Genetics is definitely near the top of the chain when it comes to that.
For sure.
I hope he continues to do the amazing work he's done.
I mean, for purples and
Pinks,
consistency in purples and just like really photogenic weed that's usually like frosty and very pungent. I've never really had a Relentless Genetics cut or seed or anything that I've grown out where it didn't reek of something delicious. So yeah, consistency is pretty great with that guy.
I'm looking forward to seeing what Chris Lynch puts out with Compound, or not with what's his new Cypher. Sorry,
Cypher. Yep.
Cypher Genetics. That Blue Lobster, like everything he touches personally looks good. I can't especially speak for what makes it to market. Some of the people he's surrounded himself with have some predatory tendencies in this industry with this market, but
yep.
The stuff that he personally builds and grows and finds, I put him up there as some of the best breeders on earth for sure.
Definitely. Yeah, I'd agree with that. All right, just one more. So you've been probably consuming cannabis, I assume, before you were growing it. So let's talk about your most memorable cannabis-related experience.
First time I ever smoked, for sure.
All right, tell me about it.
I was... Actually, you know what? Let's skip that story. It's not as interesting because I just realized the one where I didn't even smoke yet was interesting. So,
all right.
My stepdad used to smoke cigarettes occasionally, and we'd go fishing every Monday night, and we'd stay till 2 a.m, and I'd do my thing, little kid running around fishing. He'd sit there hacking his darts or whatever, fishing like dads do. And this would go on for my entire childhood. And as I got older, I started hanging out with friends. And one day, I'm by myself with my friend Mike Ellie, and we're driving around in a car, and his car, and we pull up to another person's car in a parking lot, and he passes him what I thought was a cigarette. And I'm not even 14 yet. Like, I turned 14 that winter or whatever, and it's summer, and I'm still a 13-year-old kid. And he passes him the cigarette through the window, and he smokes it. And I remember catching a whiff of it. And all of a sudden, like in the movies, you saw everything just play backwards every time I saw my stepdad put that joint in his mouth. Because the olfactory flood that I got smelling it, like,
gosh.
Motherfucker, that wasn't cigarettes. Because I had just seen finally that he had been smoking weed in front of me this whole time. And immediately it all clicked, and it was just such an epiphany for me that I think that kid was the first person I had ever ended up smoking with next in the same car. But just the shock, the instantaneous sort of visceral knowledge that comes flooding back when you got that first smell was something I'll never forget for sure.
Did you like ask your friend what is that? And he's like, oh, it's weed, man. And instantly that changed everything because you're like, I sat
silently in the back seat, just dumbfounded, like, what? I had no idea. I thought my stepdad was like a straight edge guy, just and it turns out that he was just as cool as the rest of us. So it definitely changed and I think I was a little nervous to approach my stepdad for a while about it, but for a while it was just a I know, kind of deal.
No, that's so funny.
But eventually, obviously, we ended up sharing a doob or two together, and it was quite a coming of age experience for sure.
For sure. No, that's it. I mean, I feel like there's a cinematic nature to that with the realization and the, hanging out with stepdad on the weekends, getting, going fishing and him lighting up a cigarette. You could almost see it playing out.
Yeah,
you
could definitely hear the
doesn't want him
scratch.
smoking at home. Yeah. Oh, that's great. Well, Shark, this has been a great interview. Tell Follow3rfox I really appreciated her joining us as well. We'll have to do more of these in the future. Maybe do some deep dives on some specific topics and just get more information out there to people because you are a smart guy. You put in the effort.
Like I said, I've not had plants in the ground for a little while. I definitely miss talking shop. I don't know if you can tell, but I certainly just love hanging around, just chewing the fat. It's one of the things I'm passionate about. So anytime you want to have me back, I'm more than happy and welcome.
Awesome. Well, it's conversations like these that help other people learn more and apply that knowledge. And like I like to say, that's the way we grow. And that's why the podcast is called what it is. So again, thank you so much. And we'll talk soon.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it very much. And I look forward to doing it again.
Awesome.
Bye now.